the kind introduction and for inviting me to talk here. In the short answer to my question, do sanctions help to limit nuclear proliferation, is yes. But it's a very, very qualified yes. Yes, and yes, I can see some surprised reactions.
The Israelis in the room jump already. Yes.
But I want to be very careful about conveying to you that it's a very, very, very qualified yes. So I just, it's not that they're completely useless, but it's not that they are a panacea either. So I'm trying to get at the nuances of what sanctions do to nuclear programs. So as I said, it's a qualified yes, and I think sanctions can contribute to slowing nuclear programs, possibly in two ways. And one is by physically limiting the ability to pursue the nuclear program. And that means it can be financial, it can be technological. Secondly, it is by persuasion. It is by convincing the leadership that this is just not worth it. So these are two, I think it's useful to think of them as two separate processes, but possibly related. I also want to point out that the sanctions are almost never successful by themselves in doing this. And I don't think this means that sanctions are useless, because even military force is usually not totally successful purely by itself. So like all tools of foreign policy, sanctions also must be conceived as a larger strategy of maybe of coercion, and then you might have to use other tools like diplomacy and military force. So one of the most interesting things that I'm looking at is the interaction between sanctions and military force, and it's quite fascinating. It's not a linear or straightforward relationship as you might expect.
Can I ask a clarification question? Do you also talk somewhere in the presentation today, beside leaving the rogue nation, why there is an effort to go into this activity? What motivations are in that area? Because I believe that any sanction design, they somehow have to reflect what your own understanding is why country X or Y might go into that direction.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I actually took out the slide that I originally had, thinking that I won't have time to get into that. But it does affect my research, definitely, and I draw on the existing literature which talks about possible reasons why a country might want nuclear weapons. And number one is security concerns. And definitely when I get into my case studies, hopefully I can show you how it plays into how they react, because it has to do with why they want it in the first place. Yeah. But I don't know if I will have time to talk at length about it today. Yeah. Okay, so my argument is that sanctions can induce nuclear reversal through resource limitations, or what is called the brute force effect of sanctions. That is just the ability to pursue nuclear weapons. And secondly is changes in motivations, and that's the coercive effect of sanctions. And this is based on limited case studies, so obviously then there are limitations to how much I can extrapolate, because it's a first cut. Because there's nothing in the literature, surprisingly, that looks at sanctions and nuclear programs systematically, and I'm trying to do that. So it's still like a possibility probe. It's still, I think, one of the first studies, so it doesn't get to too much generalizability. And the cases that I'm looking at are Iraq, Libya, Taiwan, and Iran. And today I will focus on Iraq and Libya, and if there is time, touch on Taiwan and Iran. Iran is, I'm sure we want to talk about that more, and my research is still ongoing on Iran, so I would really like your feedback, especially on Iran. But yeah, and hopefully I have here Taiwan as a non-rogue state that you mentioned, and I was trying to get as much of a representation as possible, both of countries that are hostile with the US and friendly. But 4 is still a lot for me to do in detail, so I had to limit it. Okay. So what is the aim of my dissertation and my project is to understand if sanctions played any role at all in the nuclear program, if they affected the nuclear program. The attractive thing about sanctions, if they might work, is that they could be a possible middle ground between diplomacy and military force. Now that is not to say that they don't have costs, and they can be devastating, as we saw, especially with Iraq. But they hold out this attractive feature that they could be useful, and in intermediate tool between diplomacy and military force. And my aim is also to bring together insights from, there's a large body of work on sanctions, the sanctions literature, and a more limited body of work on proliferation. And these two have simply not talked to each other, as far as I can tell. So my aim is to bring their insights together. I had a slide on the proliferation literature which talked a little bit about the motives, but I took it out thinking, I won't have time. I will just talk about the sanctions literature. From the sanctions literature, what I get here is the definition of sanctions as the deliberate government withdrawal or threat of withdrawal of customary economic relations to seek change in the particular policy in a targeted country. So the number one thing that jumps out is the political nature of the sanctions. So you are looking for a particular change in target behavior. So that's important. The other thing is it can be the actual withdrawal or the threat of withdrawal. So the threat of sanctions also counts as sanctions. And the last thing is that it has to be based on customary economic relations. So we need to go back and look at what was the nature of the economic relationship between the countries in order to decide if there are sanctions. There is a lot, as I said, in the sanctions literature, and they generally don't agree with each other. The only thing that generally is agreed is that sanctions don't work. The most optimistic assessment is that they might work a third of the time, but that also has been contested. And so generally, scholars think that sanctions are not likely to work. So that already tells you what to expect in the case of nuclear programs. And there's a lot of disagreement on what factors affect sanctions and how they might affect them. And I'll just give you some examples. If you look at unilateral versus multilateral sanctions, it's usually thought the sanctions have to be multilateral to be successful. And that is because, as you can see in the case of US sanctions on Iran and Libya, for example, if the US stops importing oil from these countries, then other countries can start importing oil, so that defeats the purpose. So you would expect that sanctions have to be multilateral. But an important study on sanctions actually argues that unilateral sanctions work better simply because multilateral sanctions are unwieldy. You need to get everybody to agree on why the sanctions are being imposed, what sanctions, for how long, and that gets very tricky. So it's oftentimes easier to be flexible if the sanctions are unilateral. So
may I ask you, what's the standing of the Hufbauer study at IIE? Is that thought to be a pretty good
yes,
study?
that is exactly what I'm referring to. When they argue that unilateral sanctions are, and that's a lot of research has come out of their work, and they remain kind of one of the most significant, especially in terms of quantitative large-scale studies. Nobody beats them. Yeah. And they have a newer edition, so they try to incorporate some of it. Yeah.
But the half-hour study, but the problem with that is, so these are all good analytical points on that. But the outcome, if one wants to see if these sanctions, what the final outcomes were, they are not all successful.
Mm-hmm.
You see, that is, so I'm just simply saying when one make a case of unilateral versus multinational, it all need to be looked at it, what did you specify in the beginning the desired goal was.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it that Hubert little bit was not sure that I was understood what the hypothesis began and the verification of the hypothesis.
So you're saying that it depends on the goal, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's somebody, you have to specify, because sanction is a very generic word.
Mm-hmm.
But you need to specify, we want X, Y, Z outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see which one the unilateral or multilateral will be, and then try to say, because otherwise most of the reasoning I saw, which makes sense to me, a priori reasoning is for unilateral sanctions.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with you, and that's one of my complaints or problems with the sanctions literature, is that you can't say too much a priori. You really need to look into the specifics of the case, and it depends on the overall process, depends on what's being demanded, on what kind of relationship you have with the country, and all that. So one of the problems with defining success is that the goals change over time, or there are conflicting goals. I mean, we see this all the time, especially with Iraq or even with Iran. I mean, do you want him out of power? Do you want him to give up WMD? I mean, what, and who wants what? That's the other thing. And Russia and China may be on one side, and US and UK may be on another. And all that complicates the whole thing. So yeah, and that's why I wanted to put up this kind of small list of what the sanctions literature doesn't agree on, to say that it really depends, and you can make arguments either way for these factors, and so you need to go, I think you need to stop being hung up on these things and look at the overall process. So there's a second thing here is time period. So some people argue that you need sanctions to be in place for a long period of time, because only the economic plane has to set in for sanctions to be effective. But others will argue that if you give them time, then they're going to have time to adjust. To some extent, that happened with maybe US sanctions on Iran, you know? Like the President Bush said at one point, we sanctioned ourselves out of influence with Iran. I mean, you've had sanctions on almost everything for so long, what else are you going to do? So again, the time also can work either way.
So let me just jump real quick on the time period. Is there also any analysis of when in the process of the time frame to getting to be a nuclear power are the sanctions imposed? So the temporality of how early in the process, or where in this process they're imposed, and whether or not that affects the effectivity, or effectiveness, which I assume it would.
Actually, that's one of my conclusions, that it really depends on the stage, and that's one of the reasons for failure of sanctions in Iraq, because it was a very advanced nuclear program.
Mm-hmm.
But they succeeded to some extent with Libya because it was a very nascent, relatively much more limited. And so it depends on how much are they giving up, basically.
Right.
That's the question.
Right.
If they're giving up a lot, is it worth it for them? But I haven't seen that anywhere in the literature, because there isn't a systematic argument about sanctions and nuclear. So I think that does very good. Some of the other things, interesting things from the literature, is allies versus adversaries. So there is the paradoxical conclusion that sanctions work better with allies. And I think that is true to some extent. The reason is because you have better communication. You know, they have less to be afraid that the US, for example, is trying to topple the regime or things like that. But then you are most likely to use sanctions against adversaries. So that's the paradox. Another thing is threatened versus imposed. It seems the sanctions work better when they're threatened sometimes, or at least are more powerful, because you can hold a threat in reserve and try to expect compliance. Rather than once you impose, you have less to threaten with. You know. The other thing is democracy versus autocracy. It's typically expected that sanctions will work better with democracies, because then the population can exert pressure on the regime to do what they need to do to give it up. But I find that in my cases, which are all, most of them are autocracies, it helps to be an autocracy, at least in the nuclear aspect, because then you have less actors to convince, fewer actors. And finally, more recent research on the sanctions literature is talking about, rather than looking at democracy versus autocracy, you need to look at the strength of the state. So sometimes autocracies can be weak, as we can see with Gaddafi. I mean, it's not just right now. I mean, right now it's really flat up, but it was always a fairly weak regime. So just because you're authoritarian doesn't mean you have a lot of strength as a state. So in fact, in Libya, it did help that he was somewhat weak. So it helped to for sanctions to work, because then he had to do something to stay in power. So we need to look more at the strength of the state rather than at whether it's a democracy or autocracy.
May I just add to the Libya case?
Yes.
I think it's very interesting part is, there is I'm coming from the economic side. You see, there was something payoff to Gaddafi, in the sense is, if you want to join us, there is a price to pay for that. And there was some demonstrated action which had taken place elsewhere in other countries. So Gaddafi did cost-benefit analysis, and he thought, well, and he was the autocrat, therefore he didn't have to consult with his people. And so that's why I just say there are trade-offs on that is, and that trade-off, in his eyes, he thought he was getting a better deal out of it. And on the other hand, Iraq guy, who always thought that he will find a way, some way to get out of it.
But was it clear that Libya actually had a nuclear program?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
I mean, there are varying reports on whether it was more in the head of Gaddafian papers and whether they actually started going down the line. Of
They had some components. Now the question, they didn't have scientific infrastructure. They even apparently didn't have the ability to put together components that they got from the AQ Khan network. But that still, that still doesn't take away from the fact that he gave it all up, what he had. I mean, he didn't have a lot.
Right, but the question is whether whatever he had precisely because he was thinking of exacting some price without actually planning to go down the road, which might again make a huge difference to what extent they would be amenable to sanctions, because
I totally agree. It wasn't that important to him as it was for Saddam Hussein.
Right.
It was more, it was maybe more like a prestige issue,
Right.
a little bit maybe for security, but that's why it was possible for him to give it up more easily than for Saddam Hussein, for whom it was vital, Again, going back to, I think I already covered this, this concept of the brute force effect and coercive effect, I'm actually taking from the political science literature on coercion, on military force, and that's Thomas Schelling, a classic work in 1966. And he's talking about this distinction between brute force and coercion for military force, and I'm basically, I think it's useful to apply that division to sanctions, and I haven't seen that done in the sanctions literature. So, because I think we need to think of overall processes rather than specific factors that affect sanctions. So that's what I'm doing. And I'm also looking at what is the relationship between brute force effect and coercive effect. It's not as straightforward as you might expect. It's not always the case that brute force enhances coercion. So I find that interesting. So Thomas Schelling's concept of coercion, just briefly, it is bargaining. So it must be mutually beneficial, no matter how hostile two parties are. There must be a better place that both parties can get to, otherwise you can't have coercion. So that's why automatically that means it will be easier with friends. Within coercion, he has two concepts, deterrence and compellence, and I don't want to get into all the complications of those concepts, but for me what is relevant here is the concept of compellence, which is basically you have to go back on something that's already been undertaken. So that's much more difficult to achieve than asking a country not to start a nuclear program. So what I'm looking at is countries that already have nuclear programs, can you convince them to slow it down or to go back? And that's already, it is expected to be difficult because there are more costs involved, there's a bigger loss of phase, there are vested interests, so it's a harder thing to do. And according to Schelling, the requirements for compellence, some of them are you should have a clear demand, the threat should be credible and potent, so it should be painful sanctions, it shouldn't be just superficial sanctions. It should be assured to the leadership that once they comply with these particular demands, there won't be additional demands. Again, that's one of the biggest problems we see in imposing sanctions. Because Saddam Hussein, towards the end, he concluded that no matter what he does, sanctions are going to be there because the aim is to get him out. And so that's one critical thing. And another thing is to assure that that threat or that punishment of sanctions will actually end if they comply. That's again difficult to convince if you have a hostile relationship. And interestingly, some of this was achieved with Gaddafi, and I think so there are some lessons to be learned. It's hard to do, especially if you have a hostile relationship. So we see that communication is really, really key here to get coercion going. And also, Schelling himself argues that threats will work better than the actual punishment. And again, for the reasons that I already mentioned, you have something to hold in reserve, and it's more flexible. I mean, if you haven't actually imposed the sanctions, then you can make it look scary, you can make it look smaller, as you like. Okay, now moving on to the case studies, I'll talk about Iraq and Libya. So Iraq's nuclear reversal, the surprising thing is that Iraq's nuclear program actually ended in '91. So it's way before most people thought. I mean, it's not just the Bush administration, but everybody thought it was still going on. So the Bush administration had appointed this committee, the Iraq Survey Group, which came out with the most definitive report we have on what happened. And even according to that report, Iraq did not possess a nuclear device, nor had it tried to reconstitute a capability to produce nuclear weapons after '91. So the cutoff point here is the Gulf War of '91. Right. So I think nothing much happened after that. When I look at it in detail, you find that most aspects were gone by 92, pretty soon after the war, but almost everything was gone at least by 94, once the inspections started. So I think Iraq is quite an interesting case because the program ended, and despite the fact, for all that we know, Saddam Hussein really wanted nuclear weapons right until the end, right until the 2003 war. Despite that, there was no nuclear program since 91. So it's unique in that it was based on just the physical ability to pursue nuclear weapons. And I don't know any other case like this, and I would be interested in talking with you more. So despite continuing motivations, just the physical limitations prevented him from having a nuclear program.
If I can jump in.
Sure.
There's also, though, the combination of military force, because one of the reasons, right, that they were not able to get it was the Israeli strike in 81 on Iraq that slowed down the plans that were beforehand, right? It was clear they were on and so they had to start, basically restart the program. And then obviously in 1991, the miscalculation with respect to Kuwait, so you have an interplay here, right? A military force that is playing all the time and intervening in two very forceful moments that were critical to the program. So how do these factor in?
I'm coming to that totally. And in Iraq, I think that the overarching decisive factor was military force. I mean, in fact, for me, I went into thinking that sanctions might have played a role because the sanctions on Iraq were just total. I mean, nobody's ever faced sanctions like this ever in the history of the world. So I mean, I really thought sanctions had something to do with it, but sanctions were the least important for the nuclear program. And you mentioned the Israeli attack in 81. That definitely, brought a phase of nuclear reversal to the program, but it just seemed to have motivated him further. Because what happened after the Israeli strike is the program went underground, and the program shifted from plutonium reprocessing to uranium enrichment. In fact, the whole uranium, he had like some 5 different methods for uranium enrichment, which started after the Israeli raid. And because it seemed to have convinced him, basically, and he tried to get France, the reactor that Israel destroyed, Iraq had got from France. And then France refused to rebuild it after the Israeli strike. In 81, Israel had just destroyed the reactor. So once it became obvious that France is not going to rebuild it, he basically went all out. So it did a temporary setback, the Israeli strike, but certainly didn't prevent him.
And France is, I'm sorry, my memory's been hazy on this. France refused to do it because they declared that his intentions were bad. Is that it?
Well, it became too much international pressure from US and Israel. They had already been concerned about the France deal because it involved sending some highly enriched uranium fuel and all that. But France was anyway going ahead with it. But I think after that it became, I think it's for political reasons. They decided it was not worth it because the.
Do you remember what their official reason was?
I don't know.
What year was that?
81 was the Israeli strike. And then I think by 84, it was clear that France was not.
Well, I think your point is very well taken, because in a democratic society like France at that time, there were these issues with what the US and Israel were thinking in that term. So it would have been politically very difficult for France to continue in that vein. That is not the only reason, but if you talk to the French, especially the economic professors, they felt that given the situation was, they weren't sure they were going to be get paid by Saddam Hussein for all that. So there were both economic and political reasons for them that it was best to sunk cost, abandon it and move on.
That may be the answer, yeah. I mean, they were already under pressure, that's what I gathered from before the Israeli attack, not to go ahead with it.
But the Iraqis had paid for the first reactor.
I don't know exactly how far they got along with the
Oil.
payment.
In kind.
Yes, maybe it's something we should do. Just brief look Iraqi nuclear program. It started in the 50s with some US assistance. They got a small research reactor from the Soviets, and this is the France deal in the mid-70s. One of these reactors is a fairly big one. And then in 81, the Israeli airstrike happened, and it completely destroyed the reactor even before the reactor could start operating. And then the consequence was a new underground effort in the nuclear program. Basically, Saddam Hussein went ahead with his uranium enrichment methods, and two of them were fairly advanced and unknown to the world, to the outside world, until the Gulf War. And then he started a separate weapons effort to actually fabricate nuclear weapons in the 80s, and that really began to make progress in the late 80s. The other part of his nuclear program is after he invades Kuwait, which happened August 1990, Iraq launches a crash program for a nuclear weapon, and the aim was to get a nuclear weapon by April 91, in a few months. He did make some significant progress in just a few months, but after December 91, in February 1991, the war happens, and that puts a stop to.
Okay, also one thing that's missing off there is 1980 to 88, there's the bloodiest war in the region taking place between Iran and Iraq.
Yes.
And so I could see why, I was trying to think about what was going on in the 80s. There was incredible debate among the international community about arming either side in that war, and France would have been caught up in that debate as well. Yeah.
Yes, I think that would speak to the question about that. Yes, that goes back to the reason about motives for the nuclear program. I mean, he had motives from way before, but it really takes up in the late 80s precisely because of the Iran-Iraq war.
And the same in Iran as well.
Yes.
The Ayatollah was originally opposed to nuclear
Exactly.
weapons, and he restarts the program because of the war.
Yeah. So it's that the mutual effects that they have on each other. And in the late 80s, also the Iraqi use of chemical weapons on Iran
Right.
convinces both Iraq and Iran on the importance of WMD. Because Iraq didn't lose the war because of its use of ballistic missiles and chemical weapons. And then it seemed to convince Saddam Hussein that you really need some kind of WMD.
So I think that's Aaron's point, was that Saddam Hussein made everybody believe he had the weapons, and so maybe Gaddafi thought that was a good one for him to continue to say, yes, he had more than he had to offer after the trade had taken place. But just clarification question, were both reactors were affected by Israeli attack?
No, just one.
Okay.
That,
Had the other one not been started?
it had, no, they got it. They do have it. I mean, they had it by 91. So I think it was already there, but it was much smaller. The big one that was destroyed was like 40 megawatts, and this was like, I think, 800 kilowatts.
I see.
So.
So he had the rudimentary part of the other reactor.
He had
after-
the up to 91. In fact, the two remaining reactors that he had was that second one from France and one of the small reactors he had got from the Soviets in the 60s.
The small one could not be used for military purposes. It
Yeah.
was also relatively problematic one.
Oh.
So the sanctions on Iraq, the UN sanctions are imposed soon after, just days after Iraq invades Kuwait, and they are called the most comprehensive UN sanctions ever, and they are. I mean, Iraq is like, nobody has been sanctioned as Iraq has, and actually when I think about it, nobody faced as many inspections, rigorous inspections, nor maybe constant military force as Iraq did in the 90s. The 90s were a really bad period for Iraq. So in terms of sanctions, they were total. The UN sanctions were mandatory, so all countries were required to participate, which itself was an event because UN rarely acted without the veto of the secretary. So it has a lot to do with the end of the Cold War at that point in time. And in fact, I believe there are only like the third mandatory sanctions imposed by the UN since the UN was formed. And the other two had to do with the racist regimes, of South Africa and Rhodesia. So this was like really different. And it involved, and I just mentioned oil boycott and arms embargo because these were the critical reasons why the Iraqi economy was practically like brought to its knees. Because without exporting oil, they don't have much. So more than 150 countries participate. Now the interesting thing is, in August 1990, when the sanctions are imposed, the aim is, again, the goal of the sanctions has nothing to do with nuclear program. It has to do with getting Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. So that's where we stand until the war happens in January, February 91, and then the ceasefire resolution under the UN, which now demands a complete disarmament of all weapons of mass destruction, and it requires rigorous inspections, establishes a new agency to do that in the biological and chemical weapons area called UN Special Commission on Iraq, the UNSCOM. Both the inspections required are unprecedented. It requires complete removal of its nuclear program, and eventually what Iraq agrees to is also it agrees to not have them in the future. So it's like current and future giving up. So it was like total. It's basically the product of its defeat in the war. So again, the sanctions you can see is reflective of the what happened in the war. We look at Iraqi nuclear reversal. I think it's useful to think of it as two critical phases. One is Desert Storm, because Desert Storm targets nuclear facilities and destroys them. And the second phase is when inspections start after the war, between 91 and 94, and the inspectors find some facilities that were totally unknown and unaffected by the war because they were not known. So these two together completely removes everything that is in the nuclear program. In phase 3, when the inspections continue after 94, basically what the inspections ensure is that the nuclear program is not reconstituted. So whatever has been removed has been removed. I mean, it ensures that there's no other activity going on. How can we explain Iraq's nuclear reversal, and what is the role of sanctions? This is again interesting, especially interesting because we know that Saddam Hussein seems to have intended to build his nuclear weapons the first chance he got. So how come there was nothing for so long? I think the reason is in the first phase, critical aspects of the nuclear program were destroyed in the war. What we find was, when you look at the effect of sanctions, the sanctions were imposed August 1990. So between August 1990 and the war in January 91, he launched his crash program for nuclear weapons. So definitely sanctions did not slow down in that phase. And the inspections had not yet started. So clearly the reason for whatever slowing down happened in early 91 had to do with military force alone. Because the US specifically targeted what was known as nuclear facilities. The second phase from 91 to 94 is when UN inspections start. What the inspectors did is they destroyed, removed, or what they call rendered harmless, all equipment, material, facilities that it ensured that could not be used for nuclear weapons purposes. So I think if we look at the role of sanctions in this phase, there is some brute force effect of sanctions, which is that sanctions made it a lot harder for Saddam Hussein in two ways. One is that the Iraqi economy was shattered. So the focus for the regime was just to stay in power, just to keep itself going. So it was difficult to put funds into the nuclear program. But more than that, it was also difficult to get materials abroad, which you needed for centrifuges and very specific kinds of materials. But from what I can gather, it didn't make it impossible. So the sanctions didn't prevent it, but they just made it more expensive, more difficult for Saddam Hussein to continue with the nuclear program. The interesting thing, I think, is that inspections were very, very successful in this phase. And the reason I think that they were successful is partly to do with sanctions and military force. Because these two tools, sanctions and military force, seems to have convinced him to cooperate to the extent that he did with inspections. Because even though sanctions didn't actually convince him to give up the nuclear program, they seem to have convinced him to cooperate with inspections. Because throughout the 90s, almost everything Saddam Hussein did seems to have been motivated by the desire to get out of sanctions. So sanctions were very important from that point of view, even though they didn't convince him to give up the nuclear program. So I think the coercive effect of sanctions was limited, but what sanctions did is made him think that it's better to cooperate with inspections. So just to sum it up, in phase 1 in 91, there was little role of sanctions in nuclear reversal. In phase 2, there was a brute force effect of sanctions and very limited coercive effects because sanctions didn't convince him to give up the nuclear program. In phase 3, what happens in '97 is that Saddam Hussein accepts the oil for food program under the UN, under which he can sell limited amounts of oil in return for humanitarian goods, food and medicines and all. And that takes effect in '97 and that really changes the whole dynamic because income is coming in for the first time since the sanctions were imposed. The previous few years, the economy was like showing negative growth or zero growth, and now it actually picks up for the first time in '97. So that changes the whole dynamic. Also, he's very good at exploiting the program, the oil for food program, for illegal purposes. So he gets a lot more out of it than what he was supposed to. So that strengthens him greatly. And the sanctions erosion, both economically and at this time, sanctions are weakening politically because it begins to look like it's more a US tool for US dominance, and Russia and China are not in agreement with the US about, especially with the humanitarian suffering in Iraq, about continuing sanctions. So sanctions now start to weaken both economically and politically, and that seems to strengthen Saddam Hussein. The other thing that happens in the late '90s is there come out statements from US officials indicating that the US is seeking regime change, especially Madeleine Albright makes some almost like clear statement about that. So that, I think, totally destroys any possibility of coercion, because it becomes very clear to Saddam Hussein that it doesn't matter what he does, the sanctions are not going to go away, so why cooperate? And that changes. So I think my conclusions is that there is some brute force effect of the UN sanctions, but sanctions did not coerce. Going back to some of the points we already discussed, because Saddam Hussein deeply desired nuclear weapons. As we see, he was almost willing to almost die or be attacked a second time just for that. So he really, really wanted it. So there's not much you can do to coerce. Yes.
I think that's a very interesting point. Thomas Schilling, if you go back to that say, look, I told you, with the communication which you talked about, targets, moving targets on that, all of these things made it sanction very difficult for it to function in those situations. So what you summarize from the literature, a priori, there is some empirical verification for the Iraq case.
Yes, I think that's why I find it useful to draw on Schelling, even though he's not talking about sanctions, but the whole coercion is.
Yeah, coercion, that.
Yeah, I think everything he says is.
He's very smart.
Yes. Said it in '66 and it still applies. The other reason, I think, again, going back to something we discussed, is that the program is quite advanced. So asking him to give it up totally was asking a lot. It's not like asking Gaddafi to give up it. He was very close to actually getting it, and I think from his point of view, the biggest mistake he made was invading Kuwait before he had his nuclear weapon, which he was close to having. The other thing is poor communication, because the history of relationship with the US made it difficult for Saddam Hussein to believe that the US really meant total disarmament, that the US was actually going to go in and attack him post Kuwait, things like that. But that's because of the '80s, and again, going back to the Iran-Iraq war and US, some kind of friendship with Saddam Hussein in the '80s. It made it really difficult for him to believe that US was serious about this. And the other is finally the rhetoric of regime change that builds up in the late '90s at least.
So would you say that attack on Kuwait was more explanatory variable of his failure rather than the other factors, because that was a very big mistake on his part, given his experience with Iran, the war which took place on it, he had seen the power game, and he had seen the oil, importance of oil flow to the industrialized or non-industrialized countries. So with all that respect, and he had not won the war in Iran, but he still undertook to attack Kuwait. And I'm just wondering, causal relationship, that what weakened his case on that, if that not happened, would we have to face Iraq, a nuclear Iraq if the
Okay, you bring up some interesting points. If not for his invasion of Kuwait, and actually even if not for the 2003 war, much as most of us must be against it, I think if given the way the sanctions were going out, I think he would have slowly started to rebuild. I mean, it would have taken him time, but the invasion of Kuwait it is not complete foolishness on his part, because what motivated him to do it was, again, the war with Iran and the economic devastation that brought about. So, and he had grievances with Kuwait. Historically, Iraq had grievances with Kuwait. It was part of the Iraqi nation. And also with too much oil production, which kept the oil prices down. That was his demand of Kuwait, and Kuwait was not budging on that. So, I mean, he was trying to do a quick fix. And what he perceived as the leader of the Arab world, he was doing a favor to all the Arab countries by fighting Iran. So he felt that Kuwait owed it to him. I mean, that is how he viewed. On the other hand, nobody expected, not just Saddam Hussein, that the U.S. would be that mad about the invasion of Kuwait. I mean, in the sense that the U.S. had fairly okay relations with Iraq. So it was not just Ambassador April Gillespie who went and told Saddam Hussein, you can do what you want. It's not. I mean, it was not an aberrant event. It was the end of the Cold War is what happened at that point that helped, that enabled the U.S. to act the way it did, and enables the Security Council to impose sanctions and take such action. But those were external circumstances that nobody could have predicted. So it was not like it was a big mistake for him, but
in hindsight, it's not so clear that it was a mistake at the time. I mean,
Yeah.
if you did the calculus of cost benefit ex ante, it was not. It was a reasonable gamble.
Yeah, but I'm not sure, but from the political economic side, was it Kuwait was a member of the United Nations. He, like General Schwarzenegger, who just said he is a great general. If he had gone in and just kept a little part of Kuwait and moved back, there wouldn't have been. But so I think it was all tactical. Schilling applies to him as well as the other one, because he made a very big mistake in the calculations on that part. But your arguments are, my knowledge is out of the Economist, is exactly the kind of points you made about he's the leader of the Arab, they owe him, and at least they should support him financially, given all he's trying to do on that party. So.
Plus, there was no credible threat. Again, the Americans sent very mixed signals to him. There was no reason to believe that the Russians or the Chinese will support an intervention. There was no reason to believe at the time. There were no really examples of the Security Council actually operating the way. This is the first time. Korea is not the Security Council, remember. Right? So that's the first time that the Security Council actually operates. So if you sit and you do the calculation.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, okay.
And I think we should
Yeah.
be quiet now.
Yeah, I'm going to be quiet.
Yes, keeping an eye
Both
on,
of us.
on the time. I will jump ahead, I think, to my next case, which is Libya. Just a quick look at what's been written on Libya. According to an important article, it's the strongest case of coercive diplomacy since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And coercive diplomacy, that's the same thing as the coercion that I'm looking at. So I think there is, I don't know if it's the strongest, but I think there is some coercion going on in Libya. And there is some coercive effect from sanctions. But the interesting thing is, I think sanctions worked as a tool to convey the military resolve. So it's like an intermediate tool, I think, in the Libyan case. Let's look at the Libyan nuclear program. It began in the 70s under Gaddafi. Just like with Iraq, it was totally tied to that individual leader. And unlike most other nuclear programs, here it began with a quest for nuclear weapons. Usually what happens is it's a general nuclear program and then there's the weapons aspect, but here it seems to have begun with the weapons aspect. They got their main research facility from the Soviets in the 60s or 70s. And then they contacted the nuclear smuggling network by A.Q. Khan in the late 80s. And that's where they got most of their advanced components. And this happens more recently, in the late 90s and even early 2000s, that they get a weapons design. In Libya's nuclear reversal, In December 2003, suddenly Gaddafi makes this announcement that Libya is ending all its WMD programs. And then Libya accepts the additional protocol, that's a special arrangement with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, by which more intrusive inspections are permitted. So the IAEA can have access to more facilities and look at all the nuclear programs, not all, but more. And the reversal is, nuclear reversal was completed almost immediately, within just a few months of the announcement. All their components, the weapons design, most of it is gone. It's lifted up by the US, sent to Russia, and it's just removed from there. If you look at the sanctions on Libya, the US had imposed sanctions way from the 70s. Even from the earlier mid-70s, there were some sanctions on Libya. But they really pick up in the 80s under Reagan, because in 82, the US places a ban on the imports of Libyan oil. So that's important. And then a complete ban on trade with Libya by the US. And the US declares an emergency situation with Libya in 86. The UN sanctions are imposed for the terrorist event that is associated with Libya, and that is Lockerbie, which happened in 1988 when the Pan Am airline was bombed and 270 people were killed, most of them Americans. So that became the major issue that affected Libya since 1988. There is some debate, I don't know the truth of it, but there is some debate on whether Libya was actually involved or not, and that's kind of irrelevant because the issue came to dominate. There is some speculation that it might have been Iran or Syria, but irrespective of that, the UN put sanctions on Libya under US and UK pressure in '92, and starting with diplomatic sanctions, arms embargo, air embargo, and then it strengthens with no export of technology in the oil and aviation industries, and freezes financial assets. But the interesting thing is, if you compare it with Iraq, there's no UN ban on oil exports for Libya. So Libya can continue exporting its oil and get some amount of income from that. So what is the brute force effect of these sanctions on Libya? The economic effects were not devastating as they were in Iraq. Mainly because Libya finds new trade partners when the US imposes sanctions, primarily Europe, and the UN sanctions don't ban oil exports. So, especially compared to Iraq, the economic effects are not devastating, but there is some costs to the economy. What the sanctions did is they aggravated already poor economic conditions that started in the 80s, and this is especially seen in the 90s. Partly because they can't improve their oil industry without US assistance, especially in the technology. So it does start to hamper the economy. And the sanctions, the UN sanctions especially, do seem to block some aspects of materials needed for the nuclear program. Coercion with Libya. I think the US and the UN sanctions signaled military resolve to Gaddafi, and this especially after the '91 Gulf War. So sanctions take on a new meaning in the context of what's happening to Iraq in the 90s. I think in the 90s, given that the war has happened against Iraq in '91, and then in '92, the UN put sanctions on Libya, I think Gaddafi sees them. I mean, I don't have concrete evidence for that, but this is my guess, that because he made a lot of effort to get out of the UN sanctions. He saw these UN sanctions as indicative, as the next step might be attacking me, the way Iraq was sanctioned and then attacked. So he does a number of things after that, because then he agrees to, Libya even agrees to pay compensation for the Lockerbie victims at that point. Even though it said it's not involved, it said we can pay compensation if you can prove that Libya was involved. And then we can talk, some of the other demands that were made in the UN resolution, like talk to Britain about Libya's connections with the IRA. So Libya agreed to do that. So they tried to take a number of other steps to placate the UN and to get out of the UN sanctions. And then I think after 9/11, the atmosphere totally changes, and then Gaddafi gets quite concerned about whether he's the next on the list. In the 1990s, so he makes a lot of it. He makes a lot of proposals to settle the Lockerbie dispute. Let's do a trial in the Arab League, let's do a trial in Switzerland, let's do, I mean, he's constantly coming up with schemes to try to resolve the issue, which is a little bit different from how Saddam Hussein reacted to the sanctions. So I think you can see that he's a little bit scared. And post 9/11, again, he does a number of other things to try to get on the good books of the West. And that is, he joins some treaties immediately after 9/11, like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention. He starts negotiating with the UK and the US, like in October 2001, just after 9/11. And he also starts bilateral talks with the US. Shuts down the terrorist organization, and he shows a greater willingness to completely settle Lockerbie, because Lockerbie had already been somewhat settled. I hope I have time to get into that. Okay, what about the Iraq War? Yes, I think you mentioned that that he was scared. I think there was definitely, he played a role. For example, in 2002, some aspects of the nuclear program are relocated to other sites, apparently to avoid detection. Yeah, Libya starts the talks to end the WMD program exactly as the war in Iraq takes off in March 2003. Gaddafi also makes progress on the Lockerbie issue in that same time period. For example, Libya accepts civil responsibility for Lockerbie in March 2003, which is historic. I mean, since '91, the US and UK have been accusing Libya of being involved, and now Libya accepts involvement and responsibility. And Libya also settles a compensation package for all the victims. So it's like 270 victims and their families. What is the role of sanctions? I think sanctions are important because they conveyed, again, this threat of military attack. Because the only thing that Libya asks for giving up WMD is lifting US sanctions. That's the only direct, specific thing that it gets in return. So I think the US sanctions, the UN sanctions had already been suspended by this point, so they are not the most important at this point. We can see that lifting the sanctions was again tied with Lockerbie, because this is the package that they agreed to in 2003 for Lockerbie. For each victim, that they're going to pay 10 million, and the 10 million is going to be divided as 4 million, and the UN sanctions are completely lifted. The UN sanctions had been suspended, but not officially lifted. So they have to be lifted, and when they lift it, they'll pay 4 million. When the US sanctions go, they'll pay another 4 million. And when Libya is removed from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism, then they'll pay the other 2 million. So, I mean, this shows, what they want, and I think the fact that the sanctions are there was important to them, and that's what they were trying to get out of. And they even put a deadline for removing US sanctions because I think they really cared about it. And this was followed through. I mean, the US agreed to these terms, so that's the other interesting thing about the negotiations with Libya, that the US was more willing this time to make a deal than maybe with other countries. So some of the factors that facilitated coercion in Libya is that the program was at a relatively early stage, so Gaddafi didn't have to lose a lot. The international factors was the war on terror, the progress on Lockerbie, which had been happening especially since '99, because in 1999 Libya handed over 2 suspects in the Lockerbie case. So since then they had some negotiations with, especially with the UK. And this time the US was more interested in nuclear reversal, because there is some speculation that Gaddafi had offered to give up his nuclear program in the '90s, and at that time the US was not that interested because it was more concerned about Lockerbie. So that's, and the other, I think domestically it helped that it was just him. He didn't have to explain to a whole audience about why am I doing this. And also he was concerned about the threats to his regime, which are exacerbated by economic problems. So he probably calculated that if sanctions go away, his economic situation will improve. So I think some interesting conclusions from Libya is that sanctions helped coercion, even though they were not quite as economically devastating as they were in Iraq. The sanctions were influential, even though in Libya's case, the long-term goal was never articulated as nuclear reversal. The goal was, compensate for Lockerbie or, accept responsibility for Lockerbie and things like that. Terrorism was the main issue. It was not nuclear reversal. I will probably skip Taiwan for now and go to Iran, because I think people may be more interested in Iran. In Iran, again, as I said earlier, I'm not done with my research on Iran, so I would really like to get some feedback. In Iran, I think there was some brute force effect from U.S. sanctions in the 80s, because U.S. sanctions were placed in '79 after the revolution. Just to say a little bit more, what happened is the U.S. had a very close nuclear relationship with Iran until that point, under the Shah. The entire nuclear program, a lot of it was assisted by the U.S. And this completely changed in the 80s once the Islamic Republic is established. So I think what happened in the 80s is Iran finds it difficult to find suppliers to complete the deals that it thought it had already got. So that puts a temporary stop to the program, irrespective of the fact that initially the Islamic Republic didn't want to pursue nuclear program anyway, because they thought it's un-Islamic. So Khomeini purposely stopped the nuclear program. But aside from that, there was also some, I think, brute force effect that made it difficult to continue with the program. Plus the war. The war with Iraq takes off immediately after the Islamic Republic is established. I think there is some coercion through the threat of UN sanctions we see more recently. And that is 2003 to 2005. What happens in this period is that Iran actually agrees to suspend enrichment. And that was a big step that Iran voluntarily undertakes. And I think it happened because, again, there's a context of the Iraq war, and there was the threat of UN sanctions. Again, the sanctions had not yet been imposed, but they were threatened. So I think that threat was quite powerful, and the sanctions also in that atmosphere of the Iraq war were even more powerful. So I think that's why they agreed to. Plus, there was a less conservative government in power in Iran at the time. It was President Khatami, so I think that also helped. Now I think it's more difficult to coerce Iran for a number of reasons. And one is that it's no longer a threat. It's actually, the UN sanctions are already there, so they immediately lose that sting, once they're imposed. Now there's the reduced credibility of military threat, because the US is bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan. Iran is emboldened to some extent with the removal of Saddam Hussein and Taliban, so there is that different military calculus. Now it's difficult to really reassure that, for example, the US is not seeking regime change, especially with the conservative government, and with domestic rise of some domestic opposition. The program is much more advanced now than in 2003. I mean, it's only a few years, but there's a big difference, because now they're enriching uranium to 20% and above. So they're able to get their highly enriched uranium domestically, and they have a lot more to lose if they were to give it up now. And so that increases their prestige costs also, because it's become such a global, public demand in the media. Very different from the kind of negotiations with Libya, for example. It was really backdoor. Nobody knew about it until the announcement. But when you do it publicly, it's a big loss of face. So it's difficult to coerce. And finally, there is the politics of the sanctions imposition themselves, because Iran can see the difficulties that the US has convincing even its own allies about being rigid about it. And especially like Russia, initially the sanctions exempted the Bushehr reactor, which Russia was going to had a deal with Iran. So, and then at the same time, China had to be reassured that if they lose their oil imports from Iran, if they agree to sanctions, then no, don't worry, we'll get you your oil from Saudi Arabia. So you have to, do all these deals with these other countries, and that makes it evident to Iran that, the sanctions are politically different. So I think that all this makes it difficult to do coercion. But apparently, from what what I hear from media is that there is some brute force effect from the UN sanctions, which first placed in 2006, and there are a lot of other problems too. I mean, there's like the computer virus problem with the Iranian nuclear program, and there are some technical difficulties, not necessarily because of because of sanctions, but there are some problems with actually pursuing the program. So, okay, just to summarize all my cases. In Iraq, I think the program ended basically because of military power and inspections. And the only thing that sanctions did here is that they did help to make the inspections work, but they didn't help to end the nuclear program much, in and of themselves. In Libya, there was coercion through sanctions, and this is both through US and UN sanctions. In Taiwan, I didn't talk about it, but the US threatened to impose sanctions. And I think just because of the close relationship between Taiwan and the US, it worked, because Taiwan was really dependent on the US. In Iran, there is some brute force effect from the US sanctions in the 80s and the UN sanctions more recently, and there is some coercion also, but for very brief periods. The conclusions, I think, are that sanctions can help nuclear reversal, again, through brute force or through coercion. Now, what is the relationship between brute force and coercion? I think in Taiwan and Libya, they enhanced each other. So, especially for Libya, when the UN sanctions made it difficult for him to proceed with the nuclear program, then it helps to convince Gaddafi that it's not worth pursuing it. But in Iran and Iraq, brute force actually weakens the coercive effect because it convinces them that if they don't have nuclear weapons, they have nothing else. I mean, their security is jeopardized. So especially like Iran in the 80s, I mean, they approached a lot of countries once they decided to restart the nuclear program in the mid-80s. A lot of Western countries that just refused to deal with them once they have the new republic. And that just convinces you that you're really isolated, you better get your nuclear weapons. So I think it can work either way. The other things, again, the early stage of the nuclear program, I think, is critical if coercion is to work. Good intelligence, again, with Libya in late 2003, there was the interdiction of a ship carrying materials for the nuclear program, and I think that's, again, key. Even with Taiwan, that's one of the reasons it worked. Also, I think it helps to have authoritarian regimes in the nuclear aspect, because then it's easier for just one leader or a small group of leaders to make the decision without having to go through the whole democratic process.
So how would you classify Iran in that regard?
Iran is, it's not completely democratic, but it's definitely not authoritarian, and that makes it more difficult.
Okay, I just want to make sure you classify it right.
Yeah, exactly. And
that's a barrier. That's
a barrier.
Yeah.
Because there is the prestige involved.
Right.
And it's been a tremendous public debate in Iran, and it's one of the few places where the regime and the people seem to agree is on the nuclear, in fact, issue.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm told that this was, the people also supported during Shah's time, the nuclear energy, not the nuclear bomb. But nuclear energy issue was that the people, public, whatever, Shah was not very democratic. And I know, even though there has been election in the Khomeini, but I'm not sure that makes it democratic in that sense. But there is Iranians tell me that they understand they need the nuclear energy part of that. They think they have a right to do that part, but I'm not sure they all agree on the nuclear bomb.
That was following on that. There was one thing I was going to ask you, because the Shah was pursuing a nuclear weapon as well, whether he was always open with his sponsors or not. But it was really clear that nuclear energy was not his only issue, his only interest, and that relationship, because we know that the Shah's regime was interested in a nuclear weapon. Khomeini came in and said he was opposed to nuclear power, nuclear energy, nuclear weapons altogether. Then the war with Iraq. Then he changes his mind. They restart the program. So. It seems Iran's a more complicated case with a longer history, with two or very different regimes.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's a good point. Different regimes. That's the only one.
And it may not be particularly democratic now, but it definitely wasn't under the Shah, and it wasn't a public debate.
No, it wasn't the Shah either.
Yeah. There was no public debate.
Actually, there was no. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
With you.
Well, we better give.
But I'm interested in interesting findings.
Not that it hasn't been really interesting.
No, but I think
all that interesting.
I think it'll be good for the author to give us the interesting.
No, I think I already touched on them. It's not like totally new, and that is again that even if they're not economically devastating, sanctions can be effective, and vice versa, which is that if they're economically devastating, doesn't mean that they will be effective, as we see with Iraq. I think the other interesting thing is the military power can work either way. It can either enhance sanctions or undermine. Again, with the examples of Libya, for example, in 2003, the threat of military attack really helped. But in the 90s, in 95, Gaddafi made a conscious decision to speed up his nuclear program, and that was motivated by what he saw happening in Iraq. So again, the military threat can either convince you you really need your nuclear weapons, or it's better to give them up. Again, the brute force effect need not necessarily strengthen coercion, and coercion is more likely to be successful with authoritarian regimes. I think that's it. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We still have time for a couple more questions. I want to make sure. Or,
So, two, well, I guess quick questions. I'm not sure that the answers are as quick, but I mean, there's a lot there. But one question is, to what extent, and coercion and sanctions did not necessarily work in those contexts, but to what extent were you looking at countries like North Korea and even closer, India and Pakistan?
Yeah.
Right? Which is, an obvious, side case, although, you can add here maybe the flip side, especially when it comes to North Korea, maybe carrots as opposed to sanctions and how the interaction works. But with respect to Iran, so I want to push you now on the policy. So let's assume you're now advising the White House. To me, again, coming from Israel, the answer is clear, right? I mean, like old Cato, early enough, that is bomb. And it seems to me that sanctions won't work, right? And then the question is, once Iran gets to be North Korea, right, you're playing a totally different game. And so the question is, how long do you wait with sanctions before you actually put in the military force, if we follow all of your findings and suggestions?
Okay. The first question on the other countries, yeah, I will have to look at least briefly at these cases, which I haven't done for my dissertation before concluding. But North Korea, when I started out, or at least before the recent Libya crisis, because the Libya crisis seems to have had some implications for North Korea, is that I thought, Kim Jong-il might actually succumb because he's much smaller, he's much more vulnerable. It might be, if you can get China on board, especially for the sanctions. But now they have their nuclear weapon already. They've tested twice, so it makes it much, much more difficult. And the other, I think what happens with North Korea is almost like a premature offer of incentives. Incentives are helpful because even in Gaddafi's case, they were there, and I mean, you have to convince them you're not looking for regime change and all that. That's absolutely critical. But I'm not sure why the US, for example, I think it was in 2008, removed North Korea from the list of state sponsors of terrorism after it tested. That seems almost premature to me, and I think that works against the whole coercion. You should be able to say that you do something and then we will do it. Instead of just giving in. So I think that defeats the coercion. And more recently, after what's happened to Gaddafi within Libya, there are some statements that came out of North Korea saying that his biggest mistake was giving up his nuclear program. And I think there is some truth to that. Because if he had a bargaining chip, he could not have expected the West to come in so easily to support his opponents. So definitely it seems like the recent Libya experience is teaching, especially Kim Jong-il, that no matter what happens, you better not give it because then you're threatening yourself. So, yeah. With India and Pakistan, again, the sanctions were not that terrible, especially since the 98 tests. And then they were easily lifted when 9/11 happened because the US needed cooperation. So it's motivated by totally different things. The other thing is, again, how badly do you want it? I think they badly. I mean, Pakistan totally because of India. And India has other kind of like prestige and security reasons with China. So if you really think for your security and for your independence and whatever you need it, it's very hard to coerce. So I think India was facing the US sanctions even from the 74 test onwards, but that didn't dissuade.
But I think you might want to do that in next phase because you have a very interesting introduction to the subject matter. India and Pakistan don't fall in any of these categories. So that testifies yours that the success of those sanctions, even among the friendly, they have to have a certain kind of shilling type of things on it is because the cost benefit to the US and from now with the 2020 hindsight, we saw what happens with India because that is where the interests coincide. And similarly what happens to the Pakistan side because the interest change. So earlier part is, like you said, that you have adversaries and you have then, you may not have a buddy-buddy relationship, but at Pakistan they had a very strong relationship after the Soviets moved there. And India, democratic country on that part of it, so it still provides a contrast because there was a military in the Pakistan side and democratic forces on the Indian side. So all of these things, I think in your next study.
So what you're saying, Mahmoud, is that she has a whole lifetime.
No, but I think it is very good in presentation in it, and I don't think you are talking about just say, this is the case with the adversaries, and Taiwan even is in a different position, but then the other parties with the other two countries comes in, that makes a very interesting case.
Well, we want to thank you again. This was terrific, and we hope we'll have you back.